My son-in-law's family pushed my daughter into the icy lake as a joke. She hit her head on a rock and nearly drowned. As I screamed for help in desperation from the shore, they just laughed. "Stop the drama! She can swim!" they shouted. And then they drove away. As the ambulance crew loaded her up, I called my older brother and whispered, "They're heading home now. Do what you do best." Before we begin, if you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to this channel, Clara's Stories, and like this video. Write in the comments what country you are watching us from. I'm very curious to know. Enjoy listening, the start of the story. The air that day at the Van Doren's Lake House on Lake Tahoe smelled of pine needles and fear. To everyone else, it probably just smelled of pine and the smoke from the grill that had long since cooled. But I always caught that second, bitter undertone. I sat on a wicker chair on the porch, a little separate from the big table, and watched my daughter, Mylena. She moved around, pouring aged scotch for her husband, Preston, and his father, Garrett, and laughing at their clumsy jokes. Her laughter sounded too bright, too strained, like that of a child terrified of punishment, trying desperately to prove she was good. My heart tightened with that laughter. Even after all these years, she was still trying to win their affection, the affection of people incapable of loving anyone but themselves. Their country estate matched their status, a huge, soulless house of dark wood, with massive picture windows that stared out at Lake Tahoe like cold, vacant eyes. The lawn was flawless. Not a single dandelion was allowed to grow. Everything was too perfect, too calculated, devoid of any warmth. Even the sun seemed different here. Its rays didn't warm, they just highlighted the glassy sheen of the water and the cold gleam of the expensive cars by the gate. I only came here for Lena. Every time she would talk me into it. "Mom, please come. They want to see the whole family. It's important to them." I knew in my heart it was important to her. She wanted to believe she had a real, strong family. But looking at Garrett's self-satisfied face and Preston's perpetually mocking eyes, all I saw was a beautiful facade hiding rot. Garrett and Preston had been drinking heavily. Their forced merriment gave way to uninhibited aggression. They talked loudly, gesticulated wildly, and every movement they made radiated a feeling of absolute impunity. They were the masters of this place, the masters of their lives, and Lena was just another beautiful object in their collection. "Why is our little city girl, Lena, all bundled up?" Garrett thundered, fixing Lena with a heavy stare. She was wearing a thick autumn jacket and jeans. The day was cool, and a sharp wind blew off the lake. "Afraid of catching a cold, Softy?" Lena smiled nervously. "It's just windy, Mr. Garrett." "Windy?" Preston scoffed, mimicking his father. "Back in my day, girls were swimming in October, and it did them good. They were tough. This is a greenhouse generation." I felt a cold dread settling inside me. I didn't like this conversation. It was like sharpening a knife, slow, methodical, full of anticipation. "Leave her alone," I said softly, but loud enough for them to hear. My voice sounded foreign on that porch, like the squeak of an old floorboard in a new house. Preston turned to me, a malicious spark flashing in his eyes. He hated it when I interfered. He thought I was just a crazy old woman fussing over her daughter. "Eleanor Hayes, don't worry. We're just having some fun, right, honey?" He winked at my daughter. Lena nodded, forcing another smile. "Of course, Mom, everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. I saw Preston and his father exchange a look. It was their special look, predatory, conspiratorial. It was how wolves look at a sheep before they attack. "Well, let's test how tough you are," Garrett suddenly declared, rising from the table. His massive frame cast a long shadow. "Preston, help me. We'll escort our Lena down to the water for a little dip." "What are you doing?" I stood up too. My heart beat fast, like a trapped bird. "Garrett, stop it. This isn't funny." But they didn't hear me anymore. They grabbed Lena by the arms. She gasped in surprise, more from shock than fear. She still thought it was a game. "Preston, no, Daddy, let me go," she stammered, trying to pull away, but her laugh only morphed into a nervous giggle. She didn't want to spoil the mood or appear weak. They dragged her across the lawn toward the wooden pier. I hurried after them. "Stop right now, you're drunk. You don't know what you're doing." They ignored me. I was air to them, an annoying buzz. They hauled her to the very end of the pier, which jutted out over the dark, icy water. The lake looked black and bottomless. "Go on, city girl, show us what you've got," Preston snarled. "No, please don't," Lena screamed. At that moment, she finally understood. She understood it wasn't a joke. Her voice held genuine horror. I ran towards them, trying to pull Preston away, but he shoved me roughly aside. I stumbled, nearly falling, and in that instant, with one last smug laugh, they pushed her. It all happened in a blink. My daughter's body, heavy with soaked clothing, vanished beneath the surface with a dull splash. Only dark ripples and a few air bubbles remained. Silence. 1 second. 2. 3. A silence that roared louder in my ears than any scream. Then they burst into loud, booming laughter, as if they had just witnessed a brilliant comedy. "That'll wake her up," Garrett said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. But Lena didn't resurface. I stood frozen, staring at the black water. My own scream was trapped in my throat. Finally, she came up, just for a moment. I saw her pale, distorted face. A thin trail of blood ran down her temple, dark, almost black on her wet skin. Her eyes were empty, unfocused. She didn't scream, didn't thrash, she just stared into nothing. Then her body went limp again and began to sink slowly. That was when I finally screamed. It was an inhuman, animal cry that tore from the depths of my soul. "Help! She's drowning! She hit her head!" Preston and Garrett stood on the shore, unmoving. "Oh, come on, Eleanor Hayes," Preston waved casually. "Stop the drama. She can swim." "End this hysteria," Garrett added, turning toward his black SUV. "She'll climb out on her own. A little cool down won't hurt." They turned and walked to their SUV. I looked at them, unable to believe my eyes. They were simply leaving her there in the icy water. I screamed again, my voice cracking. "Where are you going? Come back! She's dying!" The car doors slammed shut. The engine roared to life. Preston stuck his head out the window and, still grinning, yelled, "Don't ruin our evening, mother-in-law. See you at home." And they sped away. The crunch of gravel under the tires, the distant hum of the engine, and then silence. Only the lapping of the water and my desperate, helpless scream dying in the cold evening air above the black, indifferent lake. I stared at the water, and the scream froze in my throat. It turned into an icy knot that pressed down on my lungs, making it hard to breathe. The world narrowed to that dark spot on the lake's surface and the spreading ripples. The panic that had just been tearing me apart suddenly condensed, solidifying into something else, hard and heavy. It sank to the bottom of my soul, replaced by a shrill, unnatural emptiness. In that emptiness, I heard a distant sound, the put-put of a boat motor. I turned my head. Behind the reeds, about 100 yards from the shore, a small inflatable boat was moving slowly. A man in a faded camouflage jacket sat inside. A fisherman. I didn't scream again. I had no voice. I simply raised my hand and pointed to the spot where my daughter had disappeared underwater. The man in the boat didn't understand at first, but then he must have recognized my face. Something about my stillness, my frozen gesture, told him more than any scream could have. He turned the boat sharply. The motor howled, and the boat shot toward the pier, leaving a foamy trail behind it. He was there a minute later. "What happened?" he shouted. His face was weathered and serious. I couldn't answer. I just pointed at the water again. "There, man." I finally managed to nod. He asked no more questions. He cut the engine, grabbed a boat hook, and began peering into the dark depths. I stood there watching him work. Every movement was precise, deliberate. He knew this lake. He knew what to do. And I, who had lived so many years, who had endured so much, was in that moment as helpless as a newborn kitten. He hooked her jacket with the boat hook. I saw a flash of light fabric underwater. He leaned over the edge, risking falling in himself, and pulled her up with incredible effort. As he hauled her into the boat, I saw her face. Blue, lifeless. In that moment, the ice inside me broke, but it didn't melt. It shattered into 1,000 sharp shards. I pulled out my cell phone. My fingers wouldn't obey, but I forced them to dial 911, 911. Ambulance. I spoke calmly and clearly to the operator, giving the address of the vacation community and directions to the lake. I wasn't crying. My voice sounded strange, mechanical. While the fisherman performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in his boat, and I gave instructions to the paramedics from the shore, images flashed through my mind. Lena at 5 years old, crying with a scraped knee in my arms. Her as a first grader with giant white ribbons, proudly carrying her first bouquet. Her at high school graduation, twirling in her simple but beautiful dress, her eyes shining with joy. And her on her wedding day, looking at Preston with such hope, such faith, that I desperately wanted to shout, "Don't do it, baby. They will destroy you." But I stayed silent. I stayed silent then, and I stayed silent all these years for her fragile, hard-won happiness. I smiled at these people, shook their hands, sat at their table, and swallowed their poisonous jokes like bitter medicine. I thought that was my sacrifice, a sacrifice for her family. What a fool I was. The ambulance arrived quickly. Medics ran out with a stretcher. They surrounded Lena, connecting her to monitors and covering her with a rescue blanket. I heard snippets of sentences. Pulse is weak, severe hypothermia, head trauma. They worked together, coordinated and fast, like a single mechanism. The fisherman stood nearby, kneading his cap in his hands. He wanted to say something, but I just looked at him and nodded, and he understood. He turned silently and walked back to his boat. I watched the flurry of medics, the flashing lights of the ambulance reflecting in the still water of the lake. And in that moment, I knew the old life was over. The life where I was just a mother-in-law, just a quiet, retired librarian whom no one took seriously. That woman died right there on the pier the moment her daughter went under, laughed at by her own husband. I pulled out my phone again. My fingers no longer trembled with shock. Now they trembled with something else. A cold, pure rage, like distilled water, fueled by a decision already made. I scrolled through my address book, names, and there he was. A single name, Isaac. I hadn't called that number in over 10 years, not since he destroyed the career of a very influential man and was practically blacklisted from his own profession. We had fought hard back then. I didn't accept his methods, his obsession, his ruthlessness. And now that was exactly what I needed. I pressed call. It rang for a long time. I was sure he wouldn't answer or had changed his number. But on the fourth ring, his deep, smoky voice came on. "Yeah, who is it?" He didn't recognize my number. "Isaac, it's me." My voice was quiet, almost a whisper. I didn't want the medics to hear me. This wasn't their conversation. Silence fell on the other end, a long, heavy silence. I could almost physically feel him straighten up, the gears in his brain beginning to turn. He didn't ask what happened. He never wasted time on unnecessary questions. "I'm listening, Eleanor," he finally said. I looked at the road where the Van Dorens had driven away 10 minutes earlier. They were probably already nearing the city, likely with music playing, laughing, and looking forward to a cozy evening at home. They didn't know yet that their cozy world was already cracking. "They're heading home now," I whispered into the phone. "Do what you do best." I didn't wait for a reply. I just hung up. The decision was made. All bridges were burned. The old rules no longer existed. The medics slammed the ambulance doors shut. The siren wailed, and the vehicle sped away, carrying my daughter with it. I remained standing on the shore of that black lake in the deepening twilight, and for the first time in many years, I felt no fear, but a strange, terrifying calm, the calm of a person who has just pulled the trigger. I called a cab. It came quickly. an old car that smelled of gasoline and cheap air freshener. The driver, an older, mustachioed man, looked at me anxiously in the rearview mirror. I must have looked terrible, my clothes stained with dirt, my face frozen into a gray mask. He tried to start a conversation, asking if everything was okay, but I stayed silent. All the words had been left behind on the shore. The entire drive to the city hospital, I stared out the window at the passing lights, but I didn't see them. In my head, with cold, detached clarity, a different scene was playing out, a vision of what was happening at the Van Doren's house right at that moment. I could see it. I could almost see their black SUV driving through the automated gate of their massive, fortress-like home. Garrett stepped out first, heavy, authoritarian. Preston followed behind, still smirking, full of drunken arrogance. They entered their sterile, lifeless foyer, which smelled of expensive cologne and furniture polish. Their footsteps echoed in the silence. They weren't worried. Why should they worry? Lena was strong, healthy, could swim. She had just been dunked. She was scared. No big deal. And the mother-in-law? The mother-in-law was always hysterical. She would scream and moan, and then Lena would come, as always, and fix everything. She would say, "Mom, stop. They didn't mean anything by it. They're just kidding." She had always defended them, always. I imagined Preston pouring himself another scotch, tossing ice into the glass. The ice clinked against the glass, just as the last coin in a beggar's pocket might clink. Garrett turned on the massive plasma screen TV. Some financial news program, numbers, charts, serious faces. They immersed themselves in their world, where everything was measured by money and power. What had happened an hour ago by the lake was just a minor annoyance, a bothersome interlude that was already almost forgotten. They were, after all, above consequences. Then the phone rang, not a cell phone, but the landline. They kept it for the sake of seriousness. Garrett answered sluggishly, and I heard his face change. Not from horror, no, but from annoyance. "Which hospital? ICU? What nonsense?" He listened, frowning, his lips pressed into a contemptuous line. "Yes, I'm the husband's father. Yes, got it." And he slammed the receiver down. "What the hell?" he said to Preston. "Your wife is at the hospital. Looks like your mother-in-law really did call the doctors. She must have played the drowning role a little too well." Preston grimaced as if he had a toothache. This was ruining his evening. It was an inconvenience, a problem that needed solving. And he hated solving problems. He loved creating them. The alcohol had already worn off a bit, leaving a dull headache and a sticky feeling of anger. He picked up his cell phone, found the number for my sweetheart, and called. I was sitting in the icy corridor of the emergency room when her phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. I took it out. The screen lit up with "My sweetheart." What cruel irony. I stared at the words for a few seconds, then swiped the screen and held the phone to my ear. "Hello?" Preston said. In his voice there was no fear or remorse, only tired irritation. "Sweetheart, where are you? What did your mother pull now? They called my dad and scared him." I remained silent. I let him talk. "Sweetheart, are you listening to me? Stop sulking. Come home. Look, we got carried away. It happens." Then I answered. My voice was calm and quiet, like the surface of the lake after they had left. "She is alive." Silence fell on the other end. He hadn't expected to hear me. "Eleanor Hayes. Where is Lena? Put her on the phone. Come here, I need to—" "Don't come here," I said, just as quietly, and hung up. I sat on the hard hospital bench, looking at the dingy walls and inhaling the scent of bleach and unfamiliar suffering. An hour passed, then another. The doctor came out, young with tired eyes. He said the condition was serious but stable. Concussion, hypothermia, water in her lungs. But she would live. She would live. Those words brought me no relief. They brought me certainty. The certainty that I was doing everything right. They allowed me to see her for 5 minutes. She lay there, surrounded by cables, pale, tiny, in a huge hospital bed, connected to machines that breathed and lived for her. She had a bandage around her head, beneath which a dark red stain was visible. I looked at her and felt nothing but a cold, leaden heaviness. The love hadn't disappeared. It had merely receded, giving way to something older and more terrifying, an instinct, the instinct to protect one's young at any cost. When I returned to the corridor, a surprise awaited me. A young nurse called to me, "Ms. Hayes, you have a delivery." She pointed to a vase containing an arrangement. No, not an arrangement. A huge, monstrous composition of white lilies. Their heavy, sweet smell, the scent of a funeral, filled the entire corridor. A white envelope was tucked between the flowers. I knew who it was from. I walked over and took the envelope. Inside, on expensive, embossed paper, one sentence was written in calligraphic script. "My dear, let's not let your mother's theatrics spoil our fun." I read it, then read it again. Not a single muscle moved in my face. I folded the note neatly and put it in my pocket with Lena's cell phone. This note wasn't an apology, it was a declaration of war. They not only regretted nothing, but they didn't even understand what had happened. They still thought it was a game, a performance staged by me. They still saw themselves as the directors. They didn't know that I had already changed the script, and in my version of this play, entirely different roles were cast for them. I turned to the nurse. "Please throw these away," I said, nodding toward the lilies. "My daughter is allergic to them." The nurse looked at me, confused, then at the luxurious flowers, then back at me. Pity and incomprehension mixed in her gaze. She probably thought I was insane with grief. She nodded and walked away, and I was left in the corridor which, without that screaming white spot, now seemed even grayer and more faceless. I spent the night at the hospital on a hard chair outside the ICU door. I didn't sleep. I stared at the white door, behind which my daughter was fighting for her life, and I planned. But these weren't the thoughts a mother usually has in such a situation. I didn't pray, didn't cry, didn't replay the events in my mind. I plotted. I knew Isaac was already working. I knew my brother. My short phone call was not just a plea for him, but a signal he had been waiting for all those years of obscurity without knowing it. Isaac was like a hound dog that had been chained up for too long. In the past, he had been the best investigative journalist in the country. He saw through people, sniffed out lies like a predator smells blood. He knew how to find threads that others wouldn't even dare to pull. But his methods were too harsh, too reckless for the glossy world of major journalism. He didn't play by the rules. He cut open sores without caring who he splattered with the pus. And one day, he touched the wrong man. His career was destroyed. He was fired, lost his press credentials, became an outcast. He retreated underground, scraping by with small freelance jobs, writing under pseudonyms, but he hadn't lost his edge. I knew that, and I also knew where he would start. He wouldn't dig in the present. That was too trivial for him. Arguments, drunken outbursts, family squabbles. That wasn't his level. Isaac always looked for the root, the cause. He would dive into the past of Garrett Van Doren. The morning brought the smell of hospital coffee and good news. Lena was moved to a regular room. She was conscious again. The doctor said it was a miracle. I knew it wasn't a miracle. It was her will to live. My girl had always been a fighter. She had just been fighting on the wrong side for too long. I walked in. She lay there, her head turned to the window. She was very weak, barely speaking. "Mom," she whispered. I took her hand. It was cold. "I'm here, baby. I'm with you." She looked at me, and tears welled up in her eyes. "Did he call? Preston?" I didn't lie to her. "Yes, and he sent flowers." "What did he say?" A faint, dying hope was in her voice. I looked her straight in the eye. "He said I was being dramatic." She didn't answer, just turned back to the window, and a tear slowly ran down her cheek. Just one. In that single tear was more pain and disappointment than in any scream. In that moment, I knew she was starting to see too. The icy lake water had washed away the veil she had worn for years. The phone rang in the afternoon when I had gone out to the hospital park for some fresh air. The number was unknown. "Yes, this is Eleanor." Isaac's voice was hoarse and tired. He hadn't slept all night. I knew it by the way he spoke the words, as if rolling hot stones in his mouth. "I have something for you." He didn't beat around the bush. He got straight to the point. "I found some old archives. 22 years ago. Same lake, a different boat. Garrett Van Doren and his business partner at the time, a man named Malcolm Pierce. They went fishing. Only Van Doren returned. He claimed Pierce was drunk, fell overboard, and hit his head on the propeller. An accident." I listened, and the cold that had settled in me by the lake shore grew denser. "The case was closed after a week," Isaac continued. "Too fast for a story like that. I tracked down the detective who handled the case, Detective Ron Healy. He's retired now and keeps bees in a quiet rural town in the Sierra foothills. The old man fought me for a long time," Isaac said. "But I know how to be persuasive." I knew what he meant. His persuasion could break others too. Healy caved. He said he was heavily pressured from above. They brought him an envelope full of cash and a photo of his daughter, a college student, and he signed everything. He said that sin has tormented him his whole life. The picture that was coming together was gruesome, ugly, but terrifyingly logical. "But that's not all," Isaac said. "Pierce had a son. He was about 10 years old back then. They had no contact. The father had left the family. I found him. He works now as a simple auto mechanic in Oakland. He hates his father, but he kept some of his things. Among them letters. Letters Pierce wrote to his sister shortly before his death. In them, he wrote clearly that Van Doren had cheated him out of almost all his business shares. He intended to go to the district attorney. A week after that letter, he accidentally drowned." I closed my eyes. The vague, unexplained anxiety I had felt all those years near the Van Dorens, the worry that everyone, including my own daughter, attributed to my overly anxious nature, wasn't anxiety. It was intuition, a deep animal sense that had screamed at me that monsters were living next to my daughter. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't shocked. I only felt a strange, icy confirmation, as if I had walked through a dark room all my life, bumping into furniture, and now someone had flipped the light switch, and I saw that the room was full of traps. "What now?" I asked. My voice was perfectly calm. "Now we have leverage," Isaac replied. "They think this is a family dispute. They don't know we're playing a different game." He was right. This was no longer a reaction to their act. It was no longer the revenge of an injured mother. It was an act of restoring justice, the justice that had been sunk with Malcolm Pierce's body in that same lake 22 years ago. I was ready to go all the way. Now I not only had the right, I had the evidence. I hung up and sat on the bench in the hospital park for a long time. The autumn sun shone faintly through the bare branches of the trees, but it didn't warm me. I looked at my hands. They were no longer trembling. They were steady. They were the hands of a person who knew what to do next. The next 2 days passed in the fog of hospital routine. I brought Lena broth that I made on a small electric burner right in the room, helped her walk to the bathroom, and read Chekhov to her. We barely talked about what happened. Words weren't necessary. Something new, fragile, but genuine developed between us, a silent understanding. She no longer tried to justify them. She simply remained silent, and in her silence was more condemnation than in all my words. Preston stopped calling. He had apparently decided to starve us out. He was waiting for Lena to calm down and call him herself, as was always the case after their arguments. He didn't understand that this time, everything was different. He was still playing his game, by his rules, in his small, cozy world where he was king. He didn't know that outside his world, the clouds were already gathering. The climax came on the third day. I imagine it like this. Garrett Van Doren is sitting in his huge office, furnished with dark oak and leather. perfect order on his desk: an expensive pen, a notebook, several phones. He skims the morning stock report on CNBC. He is calm. He has the situation under control. The family annoyance with his daughter-in-law barely bothers him. That's Preston's problem. Small, everyday, solvable. Women always cause trouble. You just have to show toughness, and they crawl back and apologize on their own. At that moment, one of his phones rings, the one without caller ID, the line for particularly sensitive conversations. He sees who's calling, and a satisfied smile appears on his face. It's an old friend, an important man from the regional administration, Mayor Jim Dalton, a man he had helped solve problems for many years, a man who owed him a favor. "Jim Dalton, pleased to hear from you," he says in his velvety, confident voice. "To what do I owe the honor?" But on the other end, he hears no friendly greeting, only a dry, cold, almost hostile tone. "Garrett, I need to speak to you seriously and not over the phone." Garrett frowns. He doesn't like this tone. It disrupts the accustomed order of things. "Did something happen?" "Something happened." The voice on the phone grows harder. "A man was here today. He claimed to be a journalist, though he looked more like a district attorney, very persistent." Internally, something constricts in Garrett for the first time, a cold, unpleasant lump. "And what did he want?" he asks, trying to keep his voice indifferent. He wanted to talk about that 22-year-old case, the case of a certain Malcolm Pierce. He asked very unpleasant questions about the boat, about the money, about your argument with him the night before he died. He knew details that only 3 people could have known: you, me, and the deceased, Detective Healy. The office, which a minute ago seemed like a bastion of his power and stability, suddenly begins to narrow. The air grows thin. He remains silent. "Garrett," Jim Dalton continues, and there is no hint of old friendship in his voice, only steel. "I covered this story up once. I will not do it a second time. My reputation is more important to me. I advise you to solve this problem quickly and make sure my name doesn't show up in it again. Ever. Do you understand me?" And he hangs up. Garrett Van Doren sits in silence. The stock report on the monitor appears to be a senseless jumble of numbers. He looks at his hands, the same hands that pushed my daughter into the icy water, and for the first time in many years, he feels them begin to sweat. He doesn't immediately understand. His brain, accustomed to direct threats, tax audits, hostile takeovers, can't reconcile the facts. Some journalist, an old case, what was the connection? He calls Preston. Preston stumbles into the office, relaxed, with a slight residual scent of alcohol. He spent the morning at the gym and then at a bar. He's still waiting for a call from Lena. "What's wrong?" he asks sluggishly. Garrett looks at his son, stares long and searchingly, and in his empty, self-satisfied eyes, he suddenly sees not his heir, but the source of all his problems. "Your mother-in-law," he says slowly, deliberately. "Did she say something? Threaten us?" Preston grins. "The mother-in-law? What's she gonna do? She'll cry, complain to her Lena. That's it." "Did she call anyone after it happened?" Preston thinks it over. "I don't think so. She stood there on the shore like a statue. She was yelling something, but I didn't listen." And then it slowly dawns on Garrett, like poison entering the bloodstream. That quiet, insignificant old woman whom they had never taken seriously. Her calm, dead voice on the phone when she took Preston's call. Her refusal to talk. That wasn't despair. That was a plan. He leaps up, going to the window. His world, so solid, so unshakable, built on money, contacts, and other people's fear, begins to wobble. He understands that this wasn't about a family dispute, and not even about a drowned daughter-in-law. It was about what happened 22 years ago on the same lake. Someone had dug up the grave he had so carefully cemented over, and he knows who did it. Not her herself, of course. She just pressed the button. She pulled the cord. The call she made from the shore wasn't to the ambulance or the police. It was the call to the executioner. "She has a brother," he says dully, more to himself than to Preston. "Isaac Hayes, journalist. Ex-journalist, rather. I'd completely forgotten about him." Preston looks at his father, confused. He doesn't grasp the scale of the catastrophe. He's still thinking about his wife, the inconvenience, the ruined evening. But Garrett has already understood everything. He has understood that the grenade he himself placed in that quiet woman's hands was already unpinned, and all these years she had just been holding the safety lever. That day on the lake, she let go. He snatches the phone. He begins calling everyone whose numbers were saved in the separate, encrypted memory of the phone. People who had been fed by his hand for years, who owed him their position, their wealth. He called, and his voice, normally authoritative and calm, cracked, hoarse. He demanded, threatened, pleaded. He tried to start the usual mechanism, the mechanism of suppression, the mechanism of erasing inconvenient truths. But the mechanism failed. On the other end, he heard confusion, cold politeness, and more often a short dial tone. His world no longer obeyed him. The people who had laughed ingratiatingly at his jokes yesterday now pretended not to recognize his voice. The ship had sprung a leak, and the rats were the first to feel it. They didn't just run. They tore up the ropes that tied them to him so he wouldn't drag them down to the depths. Preston stood pale and bewildered in the middle of the office. For the first time, he saw his father, this monolith, this unshakable titan, so out of control. And fear, genuine, sticky, animal fear, began to seep into his soul too. He suddenly understood that the joke at the lake was more than just cruel play. It was the trigger for something terrifying, the full scope of which he couldn't yet grasp. I didn't see any of this. I didn't need to. I knew it was happening. I felt it from a distance, just as one feels the approach of a thunderstorm through the change in air pressure. But I felt no gloating. I felt no satisfaction. I only felt a cold, detached calm. The process had been set in motion, and now it was running its course, obeying its own relentless laws. That day, Lena was significantly better. She could already sit up in bed, propped up on pillows. Color had returned to her face. We talked a little, and then she fell asleep. For the first time in days, it was a peaceful, deep sleep. I left the room so as not to disturb her. I didn't want to wander the gloomy hospital corridors, and I remembered. I remembered that on the ground floor in the old wing, there was a library, a small room, forgotten by everyone, that almost no one entered. I had worked as a librarian for 40 years. That was my world, a world where everything is ordered, where every book has its place, where silence and wisdom reign. I found it. A door with an old peeling sign, library. I stepped inside. The room was small, dusty, with a high vaulted ceiling. It smelled of old paper and oblivion. Shelves full of books lined the walls. On a large table in the center, piles of books were stacked, books that someone had borrowed at some point, but never returned to their proper place. Chaos reigned, and I began to work, not because someone had asked me to, but because I needed to. It was the only thing I could do at that moment to preserve my own spiritual balance. I started sorting the books on the table. I picked up each one, wiped the dust from the cover, looked at the call number on the spine, and found its place on the shelf. Here, a tattered volume of Toni Morrison. I put her between Zora Neale Hurston and Alice Walker. Classics with classics. Here, an old medical guide. It belongs on the top shelf in the technical literature section. Here, a thriller by James Patterson. It goes to the foreign prose shelf. My movements were slow, methodical, almost ritualistic. I thought neither of the Van Dorens nor Isaac, not even of Lena. I thought only of the books, of the fact that everything in this world should have its place, that an order, once disturbed, must be restored. I worked, and the chaos in the small hospital library gradually receded. The table became cleaner, the shelves filled up in strict alphabetical and thematic order. I was restoring harmony in this tiny enclosed space, and this simple physical activity gave me peace. It was creation, a counterweight to the destruction I had set in motion. Eventually my phone rang. It was Isaac. I wedged the phone between my ear and shoulder and continued shelving books. "He's running around like an animal in a cage," Isaac said without preamble. His voice was calm, but I heard the notes of predatory joy in it. "He's calling everyone, trying to exert pressure, to buy people off, to intimidate, but it's too late. The information has leaked. His old friends are shunning him like a leper. He's become toxic." "Good," I said, placing a thick volume of Baldwin in its spot. "He knows it's me, and he knows you're behind me. He's going to try to act, probably with force. He'll send his people. I just wanted you to know." "I know," I replied. "Be careful." "Don't worry about me, little sister," he laughed. "I haven't lived where I'm registered for a long time. I'm safe. But you'll need a good lawyer soon, although I'm afraid even that won't help." We said goodbye. I put the phone in my pocket and picked up the next book. It was a children's book of fairy tales with bright pictures. I ran my hand over the glossy cover. I wasn't afraid for Isaac. He was in his element. I felt no hatred toward the Van Dorens. To me, they were no longer people, but objects, pieces on a chessboard that I myself had maneuvered into a state of zugzwang. I didn't need to see their panic. I didn't need to hear their anxious voices. Their agony didn't interest me. In that moment, in this quiet, dusty library, I was absolutely calm. I was simply restoring order in the library, in my life, and in my daughter's world. I knew that soon the last book would find its place on the shelf, and then silence would fall. Real, full, final silence. When the last book from the table found its place on the shelf, I felt a deep weariness, not physical but spiritual, as if I had finished a very long and difficult task. I looked around the quiet, tidied room. Harmony now reigned here. I left the library, pulling the door tightly shut behind me, and returned to the world of hospital smells and muffled sounds. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Garrett Van Doren's agony reached its peak. He had exhausted all his resources. His calls were no longer connected. His threats only elicited irritation. He understood that his empire, which had seemed eternal and unshakable to him, was only a house of cards, and someone had pulled the most important card from the foundation. Desperation is a poor advisor. It makes smart people do stupid, predictable things. And Garrett, having lost the ability to act subtly, decided to proceed coarsely. He resorted to the last argument he had left: violence. He called the head of his security detail, a sullen man with a heavy jaw and vacant eyes, a former Special Forces soldier who carried out the dirtiest jobs for him. "I need the address of this journalist, Hayes, and I need him to be spoken to very seriously, so seriously that he forgets not only my name, but his own." The man with the heavy jaw nodded silently. For him, it was routine work. Finding the address in this city was not difficult, especially with access to certain databases. An hour later, two inconspicuous dark cars with no license plates pulled into the courtyard of an old housing project on the outskirts of the city. 4 sturdy men in identical black jackets got out. They entered the stairwell, which smelled of cats and dampness, unhurriedly but purposefully, and climbed to the 7th floor. They went to apartment number 47, a shabby faux leather door, an old, almost antique doorbell. One of them pressed the button. In response, silence. He pressed it again. Still silence. "Enter," the oldest one briefly commanded. They didn't bother with the lock. One of them, the largest, stepped back a few paces, took a running start, and tore the door frame and all off its hinges with a deafening crash. They stormed inside, but the apartment was empty. It wasn't just empty, it was dead. A thin layer of dust on the old, mismatched furniture, a stack of yellowed newspapers on the kitchen table, a dried-up plant in a pot on the windowsill. It was obvious that no one had lived here for a long time. They had walked into a trap, a simple one, but humiliating precisely because of its simplicity. While they stared at each other in the gloom of the deserted apartment, my brother, Isaac, only a few miles away in a faceless rented hotel room, looked at his laptop screen. A simple blog platform was open on the screen. The text was already entered. The headline glowed in bold, aggressive letters. Drowned twice in the same lake. The 22-year history of impunity. Below the headline was a dry but devastating text. Facts, data, names, copies of Pierce's letters, quotes from a secret interview with the former Detective Healy, recorded on a voice recorder, the testimony of the fisherman who rescued Lena, the photo of the bouquet of lilies with the accompanying note, and finally, the report of what had happened at the lake 3 days ago. Everything was laid out with cold, procedural precision, without emotion, without accusation, just facts. But their totality was more terrifying than any verdict. Isaac looked at the clock. He had been waiting for this moment. He knew they would come for him. He himself had given them this hint through one of his informants. He knew that brute force would be their last desperate move, and he used it. Exactly at the moment Garrett's men broke down the door to his old apartment, thereby demonstrating their methods to the entire neighborhood. Isaac moved the cursor to the Publish button. Below the article, an address list was already prepared. Email addresses of all the major news agencies in the country, the editorial offices of all the regional and national TV channels, the official addresses of the district attorney's office, the Department of Justice, the addresses of well-known bloggers and public figures. He took a deep breath, exhaled, and pressed the button. In the next second, he hit Send in his email program. That was it. The mechanism was set in motion. The genie was out of the bottle. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. But then his cell phone, which lay next to him on the table, began to vibrate. First one call, then a second. Then it vibrated nonstop. Journalists, smelling blood, pounced on the prey. The story that Garrett Van Doren had so carefully tried to bury didn't just come to light. It exploded. The attempt at physical pressure, the broken-down apartment door, all of it became not a refutation, but a confirmation. It turned an investigative report into a crime story. The story instantly went viral. Dozens of websites picked it up. It spread across social media. Within a few hours, the name Van Doren went from being a symbol of success and respectability to a synonym for crime and cruelty. Their final, desperate attempt to silence the truth only caused the truth to scream loudly, so loud that everyone could hear it. They wanted to put out a spark, but instead they caused a wildfire. And now, all that remained for them was to stand and watch the flames consume their world. Isaac turned off the phone and the laptop. He stowed them in his bag, stood up, and went to the window. Outside, a strange, indifferent city bustled. His work was done. Now other forces would take action, larger and slower, the state apparatus, public opinion. He had done what he did best. He had simply told the story, the true story. And the truth, as we know, is sometimes more terrifying than any fiction. A month passed. I stood in the middle of the living room, which was until recently unfamiliar, and now simply empty. The air smelled of cardboard, dust, and departure. Sunbeams falling through the dirty windows drew long streaks on the floor where dust particles danced. The last box was taped shut. I ran my hand over it. On it, in Lena's shaky handwriting, was written, "Books. Handle with care." My daughter sat on the windowsill, hugging her knees. She looked out at the street, at the busy, indifferent city life. In this month, she had changed a lot. Not externally. Externally, she was still the same, slender, fair, with large, serious eyes. But something had disappeared from her gaze. The desperate, ingratiating effort to please everyone was gone. The fear was gone. In its place was a quiet, slightly melancholic wisdom. She had grown up more in this month than in the last 10 years. We worked in silence, a cozy, comforting silence that exists only between very close people. We didn't need words to understand each other. Every movement was full of meaning. Here I carefully wrapped her favorite mug in newspaper, and she nodded gratefully. Here she found an old photo of the two of us in the park, and a light, gentle smile appeared on her lips. We weren't just packing things. We were clearing the debris of her former life, carefully separating what was worth keeping from what had to stay here forever. In this month, the world around us had turned upside down. The story published by Isaac had the effect of a bomb. A criminal case was initiated. First, one for the attempted murder of Lena. Then, after the testimonies of the old detective and Pierce's son, the old case from 22 years ago was also reopened. Garrett and Preston were arrested. Their faces, confused, disbelieving, were shown on all the television channels. Their business empire collapsed. Partners turned away. Accounts were frozen. Their world, built on fear and money, crumbled to dust. We didn't follow it closely. We didn't read the news, didn't watch the talk shows discussing their case. We didn't need to. Our war ended the day Isaac pressed the publish button. Everything else was just the consequence. We were only interested in our own small, quiet life. Lena filed for divorce. It was her decision, made firmly, calmly, without tears or hysteria. Preston tried to write her long letters from jail, full of remorse and love. He suddenly remembered how much he loved her, how much he needed her. Lena read these letters and then silently tore them into small pieces. She no longer believed in words. The icy water of the lake had taught her to believe only in actions. And now, the last box was taped shut. The chapter of that life was closed. Lena jumped off the windowsill and came over to me. She looked around the empty walls, the bare floor. Nothing connected her to this place anymore. "Where are we going now?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, a little uncertain, like that of a person who has wandered in the dark for a long time and suddenly stepped into the light. I silently pulled the keys from my pocket. Old, familiar keys with a small silver book charm she had given me many years ago. "I bought back our old apartment," I said simply. "The 2-bedroom near the public library. Remember?" She looked at me, and her eyes widened. Surprise flashed across them, then a warm, silent joy. The apartment, small, 2 rooms in the old brick building, the creaking hardwood floors, the high ceiling, the huge window in her room that looked out onto a quiet green courtyard. That was the place where she grew up, the place where we had been happy. I had sold it when Lena got married to help them with the down payment on this big, empty house. I had regretted it all these years, and now I had our home back. I put the keys in her palm. "We'll have to renovate, but the walls are standing and so are our stories. I think we have an unfinished story there. It's time to write the ending." She squeezed the keys in her hand, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a genuine, sincere smile on her face. Not a forced one, not a strained one, but her own. "Yes, Mom," she said. "It's time." We left the apartment without looking back. I closed the door behind us and left the key in the lock. We didn't need it anymore. We walked down the stairs. Outside, a moving truck and my old taxi were waiting. I got behind the wheel. Lena took the seat next to me. We drove through the city, illuminated by the evening sun. I looked at the road, and for the first time in many years, I felt no fear of the future. I knew we would make it. My freedom wasn't that my enemies were punished, nor that I was finally believed. My true freedom was sitting next to me now. She was looking out the window at the passing houses, and the evening sky was reflected in her eyes. Freedom is the safety of my child and the quiet, simple possibility of starting over. In the small apartment near the library, where unfinished stories and unread books are waiting for their moment. And we had time ahead of us, a whole life to read them all. This concludes the story of Eleanor, a story about quiet strength, a mother's love, and justice that sometimes comes not through loud court proceedings, but through a single phone call. This narrative prompts reflection. Where is the line between revenge and restoring order, between forgiveness and impunity? Eleanor didn't scream or plead with the consciences of those who had none. She chose a different path, a cold, calculated one, and as it turned out, the only correct one. What do you think? Did she act correctly? Could she have acted differently, trusting a system that had already failed once? Or is her action the only possible response to absolute evil hiding behind a mask of respectability? This choice is not just a plot twist. It is a profound moral question to which everyone will likely have their own answer. I would be very interested to know exactly what you think about it. Perhaps you have more questions about the fate of one of the characters, or certain moments in the story particularly piqued your curiosity. What do you think awaits Garrett and Preston in the future? Can Lena build a new life, free from the shadows of the past? Or perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on what Eleanor herself felt during the key moments of this drama. Write everything in the comments below. Let's discuss this story together. If this story has touched you, please support our channel. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and of course, share your opinion. Your feedback and participation are the best reward for us, and what allows us to continue creating new, equally captivating stories for you. Since creating such stories, including research and preparation, takes a lot of time and effort, donations help us ensure the continuity and quality of our narratives. Your support, no matter the amount, directly contributes to Clara's stories continuing. Thank you for your generosity and for being part of our community. Did you like my story, and which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.